Welcome to Astro Talk and a new episode in our series Traditional Astrology. Today with a very special guest in Lisbon, Portugal, Dr. Luis Ribeiro. Do I say Luis or Luis?
Luis.
Luis is a very famous researcher in astrology, and he is the headmaster of an astrology school. And balancing these two parts of his life is a little bit a task. So could we start with that? I start with a computer to show our viewers what they can find about the background of. Okay, I have to get rid of this. This is difficult now. Okay, I take them all off so we can. Okay, now I go back. Okay, I prepared something for this talk. Now we start with a new internet site. It's called Traditional Astrology, Traditionelle Astrologie. The address is tradition.von-a-bis-w.de, and there is a subsite called Dr. Luis Ribeiro, Portugal. And we will use this link later on in the talk. And I start with a context background with this film list. Now, I don't think it's a good idea to repeat what's already on the internet. So we have a very interesting, more than 2 hours talk Luis was doing with the Oraculus podcast about techniques in traditional astrology. Then we have 3 hours and 10 minutes when Helena Avila and Luis Ribeiro were on the astrological podcast with Chris Brennan. And there you get all the background, how these two people in Portugal studied psychological astrology and then changed to traditional astrology, more than 3 hours. And then we have nearly 4 hours after Helena died unexpectedly in 2021. Luis is talking with Chris Brennan for a very long time. So all you need as information you can find here. And I myself had a long talk, 1.5 hours with Helena in 2020. So then there is a video about Robert Zoller. So it doesn't make any sense to repeat all that. Mm-hmm. So I would think we start with the book on the Heavenly spheres. Now, I recall listening to all these videos. It's unbelievable an amount of time if you watch them all, but it was very informing. The Heavenly spheres, in the Portuguese or original, it was Treatise on the Spheres, right? In 2000.
Exactly.
And yeah. you produced this in the years 2004 to 2007. Now, my question, this talk today is more like a question and answer session based on all those videos, because I don't want to repeat that stuff. In one of your videos with Chris Brennan, you said you are in the process of re-editing and rewriting the book. Is that a major overhauling, or is it just bits and pieces?
Well, bits and pieces, I think. Perhaps include materials that we didn't have time to include at the beginning. New research has come up, and we're always reviewing and revising our own knowledge. So perhaps certain revisions should be made to parts, but nothing that would change the overall structure of the book.
So basically, it's the same book with a little bit more footnotes.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's go back to the computer. This is really unnerving, but I will get it back. So, okay, here we are. Now, on the first edition of the journal, The Tradition, you had an article about temperament. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And I will start with some questions on what is said about your biography, which was rather intriguing for me. It says here, Luis has studied astrology since 1991 and works with traditional astrology, having the AMA diploma from Robert Zoller. We come back to that later. His astrology studies also include contemporary astrology, esoteric astrology, and the Huber method. Now that is really intriguing, because I got my first education in astrology, in esoteric astrology, by Nikolaus Klein, a German astrologer.
Mhm.
When you write in that article about your biography, esoteric astrology, which esoteric astrology do you mean by that?
Well, basically Alice Bailey version.
Oh, you are a pupil of Alice Bailey's astrology, like Roberto Assagioli was with the psychosynthesis.
Yeah, to a certain way. I studied that a lot. I studied that system quite well.
And that's why you went to the Huber School, because the Hubers were Bailey people too, and were representative of the Bailey School in Geneva and later in Florence with Assagioli. I attended some workshops with Louisa Huber when Bruno was in the process of getting ill. I was wondering, you are no longer a Huber student, right? You no longer
No,
practice
no,
astrology in the Huber method.
no. And I studied it not in depth. I studied
Oh,
it. I
okay,
I I tested some of its
okay.
practices, but I didn't study it fully. I don't have a
Oh,
diploma or any sort
yeah,
of
okay. And
official thing.
you were a student in one of the two larger astrological schools in Portugal in those 1990 years. Can you elaborate a little bit about these two schools?
Okay, so basically in Portugal we had two schools. We had one that was called the Chiron Center, which was probably one of the largest. It was headed
When you say largest, are we talking about 100 pupils per semester, or are you talking about 20 pupils a semester? What's large in that context?
100 or more.
Oh, that was really large.
It was
Okay,
large, yes.
okay.
Especially because the owner and the director of the school, Maria Flavia Monserrat, who passed away some years ago, she was very well known and had a very strong personality. So she attracted a lot of people with her approach to astrology.
Okay.
Yeah. So then she gathered the result. The center had been the result of a gathering of a couple of astrologers in Portugal who decided to fund it. But the main person who always headed that center was this woman, and she was the one that set up the beat for the center. The other one was by Paulo Cardoso, who is still an active astrologer here in Portugal, which is more mediatic astrologer, appearing more on TV and on
Ah,
media.
okay.
So he also had a
That's
course
low in
running.
Germany. That would be Allgäuer in Germany, probably. Okay.
Mm.
And this second school, how big, how large were the courses there?
Well, it wasn't as large as the other, but
Oh,
still
okay.
still had a fair amount of students. I would say
So,
at least 30 per year.
so my next question is: in Germany, we have an organization called Deutscher Astrologenverband. In English, that's German Association of German Astrologers. Did something like that exist in the 1990s in Portugal?
No, no,
So these schools were basically the professional representation of astrology in Portugal.
exactly.
Did that
Exactly.
change, or is it still the case that you don't have a special association like the American Foundation for Astrologers or something like that? Is there something like that in Portugal?
There is one now, I think. There is one now, but I'm not
Oh,
connected to them, so
and you are not a member of it.
no.
Okay, jumping into the traditional astrology, what would you guess? You yourself are a traditional astrologer. You are doing charts with clients. You teach as a headmaster of a school. We come to that later. Are you the only traditional astrologer in Portugal?
Presently, I don't think so. I think there are more.
But you don't know them.
No.
There's no network of Portuguese traditional.
No, not really.
Okay.
Most of them came from my school, so the ones that
Yeah.
are practicing, I know them because they were my students.
Oh, so it's your legacy of pupils
Yeah.
having the diploma of your school. Now let's go to your school and go into that subject.
Mhm.
The school, we find the school here. Okay. Academy, that's another homepage I created recently. And here is the Academy for Astrology EU.
Mhm.
And as I did with Sue Ward, let's dive into your headmaster function. First of all, headmaster is a title. Do you have secretaries, teachers, other people helping you, or is it basically your school and you are
Well,
doing all the work?
yeah, well, I do all the work basically. It's not a large organization. It's a very homemade thing. While Elena was alive, we both run it. We do have two former students who are now professional astrologers who help from in some of the functions and do some of the work as well. One of them was until very recently was the one who tutored the the correspondence course, which now shift for an online course. So it's a bit different.
Okay.
They both give some classes, additional classes, some practical sessions, but I am at this point the main.
So basically, we're talking about 3 teachers. Any secretary around, or is that
No,
done by the teachers? Okay.
that's done by us.
But booking and accounting and all that is done by these 3 people.
Yeah,
And when I did my video with Stephen Birchfield from Norway about his traditional astrology course, we went into all the creating process. How did Elena and yourself create this course? I remember in one video she talked about your pedagogic skills, which you had gotten in university when you studied geology. Is that right?
Yeah. I had for some time went into the teachers line of course, so I have
Okay.
all of that training in pedagogy and didactics, all of that. So I applied some of that knowledge to building up the course as well.
And she mentioned that you have a very special method, system, strategy of teaching, which is different from other people. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, basically, we try to. I think most of the teaching done nowadays pays a lot of attention on being exhaustive in the meaning of signs, the meaning of planets, the meaning of houses, and they spend a lot of time in that, which I think it's a legacy that we'll have to face for a long, long time of the cookbook astrology that pop up in the 20th century. So people still do a lot of cookbook astrology in any case, and we decided to get rid of that altogether. So we teach the person to think. We just give the basic methods and give the structure in which you have to reason to achieve an interpretation, an astrological interpretation. Otherwise, most of the methods, and I've seen that from students, and now with the school being in English for some years now, I have students who have done other courses, and the main problem is they are taught in a very cookbook way still.
So are we talking about the craft of synthesizing the factors of the chart?
Not really, because you only need a synthesis if you got all over the place, if you got randomly stuff, and then you need a synthesis.
Okay.
If you go straightforward with a methodology of delineation, you don't need a synthesis because you're doing it already from the start.
So you are saying we don't do synthesizing, we do our method, and our method starts at a certain point, goes straight to the heart of the chart. What is the first step?
The ascendant, as always.
Okay, in my education with Nicholas Klein in esoteric astrology, he basically said for 80% of the person sitting next to you when delineating the chart, you need the ascendant, the moon, the sun, and the midheaven. And that's 80% of the personality. Would you agree with that?
Not really. I would say that the ascendant and all that's connected with, it's 50% or more of the chart.
Okay.
Because you then have connections with the ascendant ruler with other planets.
Okay.
So I would say 50 to 80% is the ascendant and what goes around
and all
it.
what goes with the ascendant.
Exactly.
Rulership and aspects and
aspects, planets,
terms and faces and all the tools of tradition.
Yeah, because then if you did that properly and added also the mentality, so that the deep study of the moon and Mercury, you get the personality, and the personality is what drives the chart to act. The rest is circumstantial things.
Okay, and if you talk about ascendant, you're naturally talking about temperament as well, right?
Yeah.
So your article on the first edition of this journal translation, which is free, available and online on the links are on my homepage, thanks to Chris Brennan and the Astrology podcast. When does the temperament come into your starting point? I look at the ascendant, right from the start or later on?
Well, from the start, because the temperament assumes that you've already done that that assessment before you start with the chart.
Okay, now I come to a problem. I take again the future. I was when I was confronted with a very good book, the dissertation PhD of Elena, about this French astrologer.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing for me was I was wondering, is there anything comparable nowadays? Does any astrologer today has published a book about let's see whether we can find okay, this is another, yeah, this is this. Elena was analyzing in a scientific academic surrounding a French astrologer.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in the today's practice of traditional astrology, I don't remember having seen any book. It's not in Chris Brennan, I believe. It's not in Demetra Jordan. It's not in your Heavenly Spheres as well in your course book, where a single chart is delineated in full. Is my impression correct?
Yeah, you probably are. I have never seen anyone doing that.
How do you explain that? Because isn't it important for the public as a general, and especially for the astrological community who is not traditional, to get an inside look at how does that work? How does a traditional astrologer delineate a client's chart? First question, how long does it take you if you are with a client to delineate the whole chart?
I rarely do that. I rarely go to the whole chart.
Okay.
Usually a consultation is surrounding, I don't know, half a dozen topics that are of interest to the individual at that point.
Okay, so you never did a chart reading. What is that person and what is her future? This general approach, you never did that.
Well, I do that.
Okay.
I don't do it as exhaustive. For example, if you look at the chart, the few chart examples we have in that regard, which I think one of the most known ones perhaps is the Merchant from William Lilly, where he delineates the whole thing. That is okay as an example for a student, but in practice, you're not going to go through all those topics with your client because, for example, they talk about brothers, they go through all the houses, so they talk about brothers, they talk about death, they talk about travels. So there are some topics that might not pop up. For example, travel related to the ninth house. It's not always a topic that comes up. Religion, it's a topic that doesn't always is there as a main thing. So you definitely not. I don't think people have the mindset nowadays to be talking about death and the consequences of death. I don't think that's useful or
except your old teacher Robert Zoller.
Yeah, but Robert had his own perspective, something. But I don't think it's useful because most people, I would say 99% of people deal very badly with that information. So it's not.
Why give it? And it's interesting enough, in the German organization Deutsche Astrologenverband, there was a time when it was forbidden for the members. Now it's a little bit less strict, but still it's a hot topic not to do it. Okay, I understand your approach. Now your normal reading of a chart with a client, how long? 1.5 hours, 2 hours, is that normal?
Yeah.
What does that cost?
Currently, 80 euros.
You're kidding.
No.
80 euros?
Yeah.
You do realize that 90 minutes reading in Germany is 150 to 250 euros.
Yeah, I know. And I have people that I know that charge more, a lot more. But I think, well, I always adjusted the price to the Portuguese reality. I'm not going to charge 100 for an astrological reading. Is a bit too much for a Portugal basic standard.
Because of the society and the economy, and people don't spend that money.
And I could have thought of raising prices for non-Portuguese, but I don't think it's fair.
Now that's intriguing, because I started yesterday a project. I'm asking for English-speaking people like you speak English. I'm started a project to delineate a chart in total with 180 minutes, more or less, to demonstrate the craft of the concrete traditional astrology, who is not allowed to use the outer planets. And I started that project yesterday and sent some emails out. I didn't send you an email because we were talking today. And the idea is that somebody who is practicing astrology traditionally, like you, and doing it publicly on my channel, either with a historic figure or with me myself. So first question, I know that you are very sensible about privacy aspects, yourself and your clients. If somebody like me would be willing to pay these 80 euros or 120 euros for 180 minutes publicly, and you're looking at my chart, would you do that? I'm waiving me all the legal aspects of privacy for demonstration purposes.
You see, some people record their consultations.
Yeah, but that's privately. This would be publicly.
Publicly, I'm not too keen on doing that.
I thought so, because what I saw in the other videos, I thought that you might be a bit reluctant to go into public delineation. Why?
Yeah.
Why is
I've done that for classes.
Yeah, okay.
And I do that on classes all the time.
That's normal. That's normal. Yeah,
I've done that on lectures.
Yeah, okay.
But publicly, I don't.
So there's a difference between the pupil of Robert Zoller and Robert Zoller himself, who said he always did that. He even went as far. I remember one video with Chris Brennan in 2011 when he said in the audio podcast, "I say it straight," and in one case, the person who was delineated said, "No, that's not true." And Robert Zoller said, "You're lying." And later on, it turned out he was right. The person was lying.
Yeah, but there you are. You see, when I'm doing things in public, from from other people's charts, if they're present, I tend to be careful not to embarrass the person
I understand.
in any
You
aspect.
are not Robert Zoller, obviously.
I'm not Robert Zoller, and I don't agree with what he did.
Okay. Yeah.
Because he might be wrong, and that's a bit of hubris. I know, and it happens. Sometimes people lie. It's true, in the sense that people say no to things because they don't want to admit it, and they're entitled to it.
And the setting of publicly.
Publicly even more. I'm talking even in private. Privately, sometimes people don't want to admit certain things, and then as the conversation progresses, and the person gains a bit more trust, he or she might confess, okay, yeah, what you said about this early on, it's true in some aspect, and then the person explains. But publicly, I'm very careful, and I'm not at all a proponent of publicly showing your chart, always being delineating students' charts. I don't like it,
Yeah, I know. You said that in the videos. Okay, second proposition. How about a historical figure? You wouldn't have those problems with Goethe or Schiller or Rudolf Steiner or people like that? Or
no, I wouldn't.
Would you do it to demonstrate the craft?
Yeah, if I had the time to prepare it, yes.
Okay, so let's keep that in mind, that you might be willing. I pay you over 120 euros and we do that in a special session. Okay, back to the 90s. You started your astrological education. This school you went to, the Chiron school, what approach was that? Was that Liz Green and Radja, or was there something else?
Well, it was a bit. It's the usual modern mix. It had all of the psychological aspects. It had a lot of spiritual astrology and karmic astrology and stuff like that. At the beginning, it was very French inspired. It had all that karmic astrology that comes mainly from France.
Also with André Barbeau from France?
A little bit, not so much. A bit later, I think. Okay. A bit later than André Barbeau. Okay. But it had a lot of things, and there were several teachers, and each had their own approach. But basically modern psychological astrology.
And that time frame was, I think, you studied at that school from 1995 to 1999, something like that.
Something like that, yes.
And that is a time frame where Project Hindsight was already around for 3 years and longer. Did you hear about that in your school at all?
No.
No information what's going on in America. The same question about England. Olivia Barclay, was she ever mentioned in your school?
No. Traditional astrology was something that didn't exist.
Didn't exist. Okay.
Didn't exist.
1999, and then a couple of years later. Now there's a transition process. How did the impetus reach you? Was it your guardian angel or something else that you had the feeling, I want to go into traditional astrology? There must have been something. If you haven't heard of it in your school teaching, how did you hear or learn about the existence of traditional astrology?
Well, let me try to rethink those dates. So by 99, it was the first time Elena and I started to teach.
Yes.
So I would have ended that course 3 years or more, because that course was quick. It was 3 years or something. And I did it very quickly. We started Elena had some older books, because in Spain, they have been translating from the Latin and from the Arabic much before any Hindsight project. You have things.
You're talking about the group about Ali Ben Rachel?
Ali Ben Rachel, Al-Bubater, Masala. Okay. They have a lot. They had already a lot of translations done. I think most from Latin, some from Arabic. And that were circulating already. So Elena had some of those books. I have already had the chance of seeing them from time to time. And I went to a conference in Spain where I got some of that material as well. So it was around, and one of the astrologers we met here, he was our friend, and he had all of that, of the project Hindsight. He had the all that material. So we started also to be aware that that existed, because Portugal was very closed in terms of communication with any other outside astrologers or institutions, since we did not have an institution for astrology. So there was very few communication. So I started to have contact with that, and then I took Zoller's introduction course. Elena and I both did.
Okay. Now let's get very, very, very slow. This is most intriguing. To take Zoller's certificate course at first, I suppose. How did you, and by whom did you learn about his existence?
I think it was from Sue Ward at first. So I think.
Oh, wait. So Sue Ward comes first and Zoller comes later?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. We got in contact with Sue, around the 2000s, and then Zoller right afterward, I think through Sue Ward, or something like that, or more or less at the same time. They would still have that while they were starting that new library.
So I renew my
project.
question. To know that a person like Sue Ward existed is not natural for a Portuguese astrologer. How did you find out about Sue Ward?
Through the internet, and a friend of ours had contacted her.
Okay.
Because at the time the internet was already, moving along. So our contact with what's happening outside was from the internet.
That's the same time when the internet got off his feet and
Exactly.
was more available.
Yeah, and then we had a lot of internet stuff going around. So we basically met people through the internet, and we were already interested in a lot of traditional stuff by then. And so this course comes up, and we decided, well, let's get some basics.
Yeah, but Sue Ward has a course by her own about ovary astrology. Did you take that course?
I didn't. Elena did.
And how much was that to pay? How expensive was that in those days? Do you remember that?
I don't know. I don't recall.
Okay, so basically, Elena.
It wasn't cheap.
Yeah,
from Portuguese point of view.
That's what I'm thinking. So basically, Elena is diving into Sue Ward's astrology, ovary. You learned that later, I suppose, because you're doing it nowadays. And you sort of got the idea there is a guy like Robert Zoller. You contacted him, you booked his course, and that was expensive, very much expensive, for the certificate course. And now we go to the computer to talk about Robert Zoller. Okay, Robert Zoller. What can you tell us about your first? When did you get the first personal impression of the person? To book an online course is something. Was it videos or was it written material?
It was written material at the time, and there were some audio files.
Audio files.
We were still a bit before videos, so it was audio files. He had a couple of lectures on audio, if I recall correctly. Then we got the PDFs of the materials, and we would read it.
So basically, the personality of Robert Zoller couldn't interfere negatively or positively with your learning process because you didn't have any personal contact in the beginning.
Yeah. At the beginning, we then invited him to come to Portugal and do some.
Now that is intriguing, because Robert Zoller is not a normal person. Would you agree?
He has his very own special brand.
Now, Robert Zoller coming to Lisbon, what was your first impression?
Well, he was nice. He was very accessible. Was okay.
Why did he do that? I mean, that's a long journey from America to Portugal for these two guys in Lisbon.
I think at the time he was in Europe. He was in England, so we took advantage of that. And told him if he wouldn't mind stopping by Portugal and giving a lecture. We already had Seward at the time, I think. Seward gave a short orrery course introduction at that period, and then Robert Zoller came, and he gave a few workshops. And
how did you experience his workshops? Was it as blunt and direct and without any taking prisoners? Was that your own experience as well?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, he was very to the point. But we have to remind ourselves that he was at the point trying to put forward traditional astrology.
Yes, he was a missionary.
Yeah, and nowadays is relatively easy to speak about traditional astrology without getting stoned. But at the time, it was not. At the time, the astrological community was very aggressive towards anyone practicing traditional astrology. Nowadays, they don't admit it because it's all peace and love as usual, but they were very aggressive and they were very critical of traditional astrology, to the point of breaking friendships, breaking contact with people, not inviting certain. So he was fighting against that. So some of that bluntness is explained by character. That was how he was. But we also have to have in mind that he was fighting against a contrary response, because all the psychological astrologers at the period were appalled and offended by that kind of practice being reinstated and reappearing again in tradition. So there was a lot of backlash. So we can't ignore that. So that can also explain, the rudeness and the bluntness, which you will find, for example, in the early writings of John Frawley. His first book is quite criticized, and he jokes and he plays around with it and provokes. It's the same thing, he's fighting the system, which is enclosed in that modern psychological perspective. So that explains also a bit the way that they approach things. And of course, their personalities, because we have other people who simply did the work the best they could, presented solid stuff, and were not as argumentative.
You're thinking of people like Robert Hand, for example.
Sorry, like
Robert Hand would be this, what you just mentioned, normal approach.
No, perhaps. So I'm thinking about also Seward, who's always produced a lot of material. But she's not.
She's not as aggressive as Robert Zoller. That's true.
Exactly. Robert Hand was always Robert Hand, I think, always worked within the system.
Yes.
So he had one foot in tradition and one foot in.
Okay. Did you ever meet John Frawley personally?
No.
Okay. Now let's come to the conference in Amsterdam in 2004. Who gave you the idea to go there? Was that Robert Zoller? Because
it was Robert Zoller, yes.
He gave you the idea, come to Amsterdam, it's a nice conference.
Well,
and then you had this from your academic perspective of today, being an historian yourself now, but not having been an historian then, could we split that in two questions? How did you experience him as an astrologer attending that conference in 2004? And how do you view the experience with Robert Zoller and the problems arising of his presentation from your academic perspective as of today? That's probably a different kind of looking at things, right?
Okay. Let's see if I can reply to you with the whole thing. So from my perspective, back then we had just finished publishing which was our second book at the time, Elena and I, which was a research onto the charts of Portuguese kings.
Yes, so, I know that,
yeah. We went to all the archives we could find. So we had one of our first approaches to archival work.
So
on
you
history.
were with one foot already in the water of academic peer-reviewed quality.
Not officially yet, because it was we were starting to research not only this aspect of the kings, and you have to see all documentation, but also the also and we're also looking for astrological texts of Portuguese origin at that period. And it was when Helena started her history degree, more or less at the same time. It was around 24. And then when Robert mentioned that he was going to this conference, we looked at it and decided, well, at least one of us should go.
Do you remember, was it a conference organized by the University of Amsterdam with Professor Wouter Hanegraaff in Coco van Stuckrad, or was it something else?
It was by Coco van Stuckrad.
But he was assistant professor in the chair of Western esotericism, Western Hermetic, and related currents. So you don't remember who was the main responsible background? Was it the University of Amsterdam?
It was the University of Amsterdam.
So it must be Hanegraaff then. Okay, good. Okay. So you went there.
I don't recall who was the chief, the one who's headed that, but
that's Hanegraaff. Hanegraaff became professor in 1999 of this newfound there was a sponsoring by a private person who sponsored the money for the new chair, Western Hermetic and related currents. He is now emeritus, I believe, and Coco van Stuckrad was assistant professor. So it was this background. Okay, now you came to Amsterdam by plane, I suppose.
Sorry,
did you go by aeroplane or by train?
Airplane.
Okay, you Schiphol, Amsterdam, you go into the city, you find your accommodation, you go to the conference. What did you experience?
Well, it was one of the best experience I had in terms of realizing how important it was to make history of astrology.
Because the title of the conference was Horoscopes and History.
Horoscopes and History.
That was the original title.
We've just published, a collection of, well, not historical horoscopes because they were not the originals. We'd only found one original at the time, but it was on historical figures. So it was very interesting to have contact with all those scholars, and we had everyone there at the time. The big ones.
Creme de la creme. The conference is published as a book. We come later to the book where the people can read it. Okay, so it was very special for you.
Yes.
And how was the energy?
It was good. I think all of it was very interesting, and I came from a science perspective. So I was educated in chemistry. I was educated in geology. So hard science, natural science, not. So I was very okay with the objectivity of the things, and I think most of them were very objective in the way that they were presenting very interesting facts, very interesting materials, which inspired me, let's say, to pursue then that line of work, and the whole energy was good. We did have that incident with Robert Zoll, the historical incident with Robert Zoll's presentation.
Did you experience it more or less the same as you would look at it today, or was there a different approach when you were there?
Well, I knew him personally, so I was.
That's what I mean. That's what I was.
I was a bit upset for him, but
how he was treated.
Well, I must say, and I don't think people tell this story quite often, but unfortunately, he was at its own fault of the way he was treated, because his topic, there were several problems with his presentation. The first one is you cannot talk about practical astrological subjects in an historical scientific conference. It's two different universes. So you cannot assume that the people you are talking to are going like in a normal astrological conference, accept that astrology works. So you will discuss it historically. And his claim in his paper was that you could use astrology, predictive astrology, to uncover unknown facts about the lives of historical figures. So what you do, you would pick up a historical figure, you would delineate the chart, and then you would say, oh, this person did this at this age and had that problem at that age, even if you don't have the equivalent historical documentation. And that can only be achieved and accepted if you accept astrology as something that really works. And the academic world does not accept astrology as something that works. You can study it as an historical practice, but not as an actual practice. And that's where he had this problem. That was his first problem. He made a claim that could not be verified or accepted by normal academia. If he did that conference in an astrological conference, that would be perfectly okay, but not at that level. So immediately, there were some academics that backlashed against him. He could not do that claim. And that's where it became a bit more aggressive. The other problem was that he had, I don't know, I don't recall the numbers. Let's say he had 30 minutes to do his presentation, or 40 minutes, I don't recall exactly. And he had prepared an hour and a half long exposition. So he didn't have the time to do the whole thing. I don't know if he thought he was a keynote lecturer or something like that. I don't understand what happened there. But the fact that he was going to surpass greatly his allotted time to talk, and they had to stop him like they would any other person, they independently of the rank. You have an hour to talk, or 40 minutes, or half an hour, and you just have that. If you didn't finish, you had to stop. And that was happening. He was very upset about that. So in a sense, he got himself into that trouble. And at the time, I remember watching him present this and watching the reactions. And I remember commenting with some friends and some people I knew there. He couldn't bring it. It is not the place to bring that kind of claim.
I think that's an important information for other people if they cross over to the academics field, how to present astrology as a topic. When this had happened, did you sit with him after it? With James Holden was there too. Did you three sit together and discuss what had happened?
Well, a little bit, but I think he was too upset to discuss it for quite a while.
Basically, he was rather, I don't want to talk about it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now coming back to his personality, in the audio podcast with Chris Brennan of 2011, he indicated, he didn't talk about it, he indicated that his interest had shifted to Hermetic aspects and to Kabbalah aspects. That was later probably. How long did you keep contact with Robert Zoller, you yourself?
Well, I think until 2005, 6.
Oh, not very long then.
No, not very long.
Not very long. So did in this period where you have a direct impression, did he ever talk in the contacts he had with you personally about these spiritual aspects, that he is going on an Hermetic path and a Kabbalistic path?
Very, very lightly.
Oh, okay.
Very lightly.
Okay. So now we go back to the creating of the journal. Who had the idea of creating? We are now on the astrotalk.vonaviswepo.de with Luis Ribeiro. And who had the idea to edit a journal? It's a lot of information for context, what we are doing today, so I have to find my way myself. It was edited in the end by Sue Ward, Helena Avila, and yourself.
And Peter Stockinger as well.
Oh, Peter Stockinger was involved as well.
Yes.
Yes. Now I'm getting there. Okay, it's here. Okay, the Traditional Journal of Western Predictive Astrology. Okay, Peter Stockinger is new on the picture. did you meet Peter Stockinger because of Sue, because the two of them worked together?
Exactly. So we met him to Seward. Elaine and I had that idea, I think, and then we talked with Seward, and we chatted and sort of brainstormed the journal into existence. And Peter Stockinger was involved as well, because he was always a very competent at writing and structuring things. So we forwarded the journal and tried
Did he ever tell you why he left Austria, where he is originally from, and why he never went back?
No,
No, you didn't talk about it.
I
Okay,
didn't talk about
Peter
that.
Stockinger is there, and the four of you create this journal, and it's publicly available, and it's very good. And I printed the material out for myself. It's very interesting and intriguing articles. It's probably the best journal on traditional astrology ever published in the 21st century up to now, and in the 20th century. You had to discontinue it because of your academic interest. We come to that later.
Yeah.
Why didn't Seward and Stockinger continue the journal?
No, it was too much work
Oh, okay.
for just two people.
Yeah.
And at the time, I think that the one of the problems with the journal was that it was ahead of its time. So we didn't have that many traditionalists able to produce material for the journal.
Oh, that's another story then. Okay.
Which is also, once you publish a magazine, a journal, whatever, the problem is always content, getting content, good quality content, because we wouldn't accept any kind of content. It would have to be very good quality content. And at the time, the tradition was not that widespread that we would have enough contributors of quality for it. And
do you see in 2023 a comparable publication as a journal? Is there something in traditional astrology who now picks up the baton?
Not that I'm aware of.
Not yet.
No.
Okay, now coming back to your academic career. You had been on university a little bit without graduating, I believe, in geology, but you had pedagogical courses and all that. And then in 2010 or something around that, you went back to university.
Yeah.
And you studied history?
Art history.
Art history, right. That was different. Helena was history and you were art history.
Yeah, because Elena had already done history, and I said, well, I'm not going to do history like you, because in a sort of way I accompany her course,
Yes, you have been basically studying the same stuff.
Yeah, she was studying at my side, she was studying it with me, so I basically have an honorary history degree together with her.
I had the same experience with my first wife. I'm a lawyer from profession, and I was working in the administration in Lower Saxony, and my wife was a doctor, and she was studying homeopathy. And I went along. I was allowed to went along, and I got the whole education, like you said, honorary degree in homeopathy. I can connect to that. Okay, so you decided to do art history. Why art history? Is that a hobby?
Well, at long time ago, I had to decide between going to sciences or going to arts, and I opted for sciences at the time when I was very young. So I decided, well, why not go to art history? It's it was a field I didn't knew it. I had never had art history in my experience. So I said, why not? Let's see what it goes. And I liked it a lot. I enjoyed it.
When you studied art history and coming to the graduation time, was there an artist which was your favorite?
No, not really. Not really.
Nothing.
I like the medieval art a lot, and in the medieval art we have very little names.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm
okay, and you're graduating in art history. That's 2014 something?
That's 2014, yes.
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 And then Elena already had started with her master degree with the professor in the University of Lisbon. What was your next step in a master level? What did you do?
Well, actually, I was invited to do to go from the bachelor's degree to the PhD directly.
Oh, directly.
Yeah, because I had
Oh.
enough grades for that, and I did that so for a year. So I did the first year the art history PhD, but then the government would not allow people who didn't have an MA to have access to grants. So I decided, well, I'm not going to pursue this anymore. So I'm going to get back and do the MA properly and have the
Ah,
complete set
yes,
of
yes.
degrees, so
Okay.
it will make my curriculum more solid. So I went back and sort of converted what I was doing in the PhD to an MA, and got
So
an
it
MA
was
in
an
art
MA in
history.
art history, basically.
Yes, it
That
was
took
on
you 2 years, I suppose.
2 years. Yes,
So
it was
2016. Okay.
on the representations of science in medieval manuscripts, based on a document which is the first text in medical text in the vernacular language, which is the Regiment of the Body by Aldo Brandino of Siena,
Okay.
and I studied the decorated versions of that text.
And you
It's
graduated
12, yeah.
normally or with high honors?
Well, I got high honors.
Okay. So now you have the MA in your pocket, and now you could go for a PhD. But since you got the MA in art history, you might have lost interest in doing a PhD in art history. Was it like that?
Not really. In the meantime, I was invited or challenged by Dr. Enrique Leitão, who became my PhD supervisor, to work on the manuscripts we had from the Jesuit order on astrology, which
Oh,
he had published a paper, a
so
small
that
paper.
was different. In Elena's case, it was Elena and yourself having found a manuscript and proposing to do a PhD about the manuscript you had found. In this case, the professor suggested to you the theme of your
Yeah.
PhD.
But he suggested, because he knew me and Elena, basically,
Yeah,
he met
yeah.
Elena first, and then he knew me as well. And he knew that we had some of those manuscripts already
Yes,
since the early 2000s, because when we started to research the history of astrology in Portugal,
yes,
those were some of the manuscripts we had.
yes.
So I decided he knew that we were aware of them, and we had the proper credentials and knowledge to really study them in depth. So I accepted his challenge.
And this is the final product.
Yeah.
I found this on the internet. I don't remember where I did find it. Is it
Yeah.
is it in book form? Is it in print available?
Not yet.
Ah,
Hopefully this year it will come out in print with the revised.
so this is a robbery. They're stealing your product, aren't they? In the internet.
Well, when you get a grant for a PhD, it is mandatory that the PhD is accessible to everyone.
And that is your. So
Because
basically, people can find this. Now let's talk about the thesis. What was the initial proposal of your professor, Lithio?
Leitão, yes.
Later.
Leitão. He proposed a study of the content of the manuscripts.
Manuscripts of the Jesuit order with the content of astrology subjects.
Well, let me tell you what exactly it is about.
Okay.
What happens in Portugal, which is a very interesting case, is that from 1590s up to until the expulsion, the Jesuits operated several colleges here in Portugal, as they would in the world, and in particularly this college in Lisbon had a particular class on mathematics. So it was a course on mathematics which was accessible to people outside the college. So it was not just an internal thing of the Jesuit college, but something that was accessible to anyone wanting to go. Anyone here limited to the time, so they would offer this basic course on mathematics, which was not that basic. It was a pre-universitary course on mathematics, very technical, very practical, in which is included astrology. And of all the manuscripts that survive from that period, and you have classes on algebra, geometry, astronomy, shipbuilding, ballistics, you have all physics, mathematics, all of that, and the most numbers of them are the ones on astrology. So you have several examples, several copies, let's say, of the astrology courses of several years. And that was considered an oddity, because everyone assumes, and wrongly, that astrology was forbidden at that period. So how can the Jesuits, which are a religious order, be teaching astrology so straightforwardly? So I decided to go into that material and try to understand what was happening, what was the case here.
And that was 2016 when you started with that.
I started it, yeah.
And now a personal question. Elena got this Portuguese grant from the government for full-time studying in the Warburg Institute for her PhD. Now that sort of sounds like a long-distance relationship. Or did she come every weekend home?
No, not every weekend, but from time to time.
Okay.
It was a bit harsh to be separated from her for such a long time.
Because you were a happy couple.
Yeah, we were.
Yeah. How did you manage to be a happy couple for more than 20 years? What was your trick? What was your secret? Because many people can't do that.
I know. Well, I don't know if there is a secret, but we shared a lot of common knowledge, a lot of common interests, and astrology was one of them.
Okay. I won't go more into the private sphere. I know that you are very sensitive about that. Now you're doing this work in Portugal with this professor at the University of Lisbon. In your PhD, this wasn't a document like the Belly document, the manuscripts of S. Belly, practicing information. It was manuscripts about teaching astrology.
Yeah.
Did you find in those manuscripts and in your PhD applications like one chart fully applied theory, or was it mainly only theory? Manual of astrology, but not a course book like you produce for your heavenly spheres.
Well, it is a course book of the period. They do give some examples, but nothing very complex.
So you would compare it with your own course book on your course in the Academy of Astrology, where you are the headmaster. Something like in those times, but something like a course book like you produced yourself.
Yeah. So
okay.
It is an equivalent of the time, with a different didactical approach.
Yeah. Okay.
But
did you go to the Warburg for your studies or just to visit it?
Well, I did, and I did some stuff with the Warburg. The Warburg has the largest, what I think is the largest library on the history of astrology.
Yes.
And what's wonderful about the Warburg, now they're remodeling, and I don't know how.
If he hadn't had the Nazis, it would still be in Hamburg. That's not fair.
Yeah. But the thing is, you're looking for a paper. Let's say you go to the catalog and you get a paper, and you go to the shelf yourself to collect it, and you'll see it, and then beside it, because they're ordered by topic, you're going to find articles that you have no idea existed, which are very relevant to what you're studying. So you can get completely lost in there, with the amount of material that they have. So I had that opportunity, and Charles Burnett was my co-supervisor in the
grand seigneur of the history of astrology.
Yeah. I had applied to the Warburg a few years earlier, and I got the acceptance, but unfortunately I didn't got the grant at the time. So
but you got a prize award for your dissertation, right?
Yes, I did.
For the high quality of it. Can you talk about that prize? Who gave it? What organization is behind this award? Who is doing that? And why did you get for a very astrological touchy subject the prize by this organization? Who was it, and why did you?
No, it is the University of Lisbon that does that, and
it's a university award.
Yeah, it is a university award. So
how many of these awards are around for PhDs?
Well, not many.
So you are a very special award holder, because of your research. Okay.
Yeah, because to apply to that award, it has to be proposed by the heads of the departments.
By your professor, I suppose.
Yeah, and they are only accepted PhDs who had a very high level of appraisal to start with.
Yeah.
So you need to have an honors PhD to.
Did you get summa cum laude or something like that?
Yeah, I did.
Summa cum laude, which is the highest. Well, there is one level beyond that which is never given, but summa cum laude is the highest normal level.
Yeah, it's a bit different in Portugal, but it would be the equivalent. Yeah, it's the highest, and it's with distinction and honors. I think that's how they
okay.
That's the highest level. Yeah.
So it's and the application comes from your professor, not from yourself.
No, it's the department.
And is there money involved?
Is there? Yes.
Oh, you got a few euros, but it's the honor basically, which stands.
It's the honor basically. Yes, it's not going to make you rich.
And it helps to find a publisher, right?
Sorry.
It helps to find a publisher.
It does.
Yeah.
You know how it does really.
Are you with Brill, or do you have another?
I'm with Brill. I'm going to
with the most high class publisher in religious science and history of astrology and so on.
Yeah. So I'm applying to publish with them. I'm still waiting for the whole process to.
That takes time. Yes. Okay. Now, both of you are high class academic personalities after this process with both the PhDs, and then you started Ad Astra.
Mm-hmm.
Who had the idea?
I don't recall.
It's very difficult. I would think it was partly Helena who would do that, a thing like that.
It's very difficult to say because we might have fragments of ideas and then we start bouncing them between us, and it grows.
Both of you had the idea. What was the original idea? What popped up in your heads? What did your guardian angel tell you in your sleep? What you have to do? What was the original starting point? Well, now we know what it's. 76 something like interviews.
Yeah, Elena began a trend which already existed in the history of astrology, but it's important. And her book is, I think, the first one to truly dedicate themselves to that kind of analysis, which is the study of the technical aspects of astrology.
Yes.
So instead of just doing the also important understanding of the social implications, and all of the social political implications of astrology, she opted to, although she approached that as well, we always have to, because things always exist in the context. But what she did was she analyzed what is the technique that is being done here. What is he applying? What are the authors? What are the methodologies being applied for that astrologer's hand? So in the same way it's the equivalent of, in the history of mathematics, to study how the equations are done. It's so that's the technical aspect of astrology, how it evolves. That was always one of our purposes in studying academically. And she had the ideal manuscript to do it, because she had the workbook of an astrologer, which are rare documents to find, and a very large one, with a large collection of horoscopes. So far, the earliest personal collection of horoscopes known.
The earliest of the Renaissance, or in total?
The earliest of the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. I think the earliest known, because we of course there would have been others. We know of that, but they haven't survived.
Yeah. Okay.
we don't have the manuscripts. Perhaps one day we can find more.
Yes,
That would be interesting. So that's the earliest known surviving horoscopes because he has, important figures. He has personal horoscopes, etc. So she had the ideal point to do that, and then there was a big conference. It was in October or November. I think it's November of 2018. There was a big conference at the Warburg to launch at the time the translation, the Charles Bonnet and his translation partner who had
the great introduction of Abu Mashar, I believe.
Yeah, exactly, the great introduction of Yamamoto.
Okay.
They were presenting this, and there was a conference made, and at the time Charles Bonnet asks us to do a pre-conference workshop on the principles of astrology. What would be the principles of that an astrologer of that period would have to know? So just give the audience a basic idea of the astrological principles that the great introduction is introducing, so presenting. So we did that, and at the time we had this idea: why don't we present the project? So we created the project very quickly. The guidelines. He was one of our big mentors on that process,
because it was his idea, basically.
He is, yeah. So he mentored that structure and how it could be done. And what we accomplished was a work group, an academic work group that studies the techniques of astrology. And then we invited a few more big scholars that I knew, that Elena knew, to be our advisors on the project. And we launched that at that conference.
But it's resting on the shoulders of the two of you, and now of you alone. What happens if you drop dead? Is it cancelled then, or is somebody there who keeps up the work if you can't do it?
Well, the project can be done by anyone that that can hold it in its shoulders, really, because it's a non-funded project.
Yes.
That has been our handicap in terms of producing more stuff.
Why is that? Why didn't the high class people like Stefan Heilen and David Juice and Burnett sort of organize some funding? Because they could have done, couldn't they?
It's not that easy.
Oh, okay.
It's not that easy to find financing for projects nowadays,
Okay.
especially historical projects and history of astrology. I would think it's not in the highest.
And your own professor, I can't remember his name,
Leitao, yeah.
Leitao, he's emeritus now, right?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
How about him? Why couldn't he integrate this into his institute?
Well, he did. So the project doesn't exist outside academia. The project exists at the University of Lisbon within the Institute for Research in the History of Science.
So you have a boss for this project. The boss of the project is your professor.
Well, I am the head of the project, but he's
the boss because it's integrated into university.
Exactly. So it is a collaboration between the University of Lisbon through the Center of Research into the History and Technology of Science, with the Warburg Institute and the IKGF in
Erlangen-Nürnberg,
Erlangen University. So it is a collaboration between those projects. So the project is headed here in Portugal, in the University of Lisbon, but it counts with the official collaboration with the Warburg and the IKGF. Unfortunately, the project came very when it was starting off. We had the COVID, so there wasn't a lot of opportunity to do things, And then Elena passed away, and things started to go very slowly. And I expect to revive the project in the next month.
Yeah. Okay. Basically, what the people can see here is this is Charles Bonnet. These are all the interviews Elena and you were conducting.
Yeah.
Is any important researcher in the field missing, or did you get them all?
Not all.
Who is missing?
Well, we didn't have a chance to do Van der Broeke, Steven Van der
Okay.
Broeke. He could at the time he couldn't, and there are a few more.
So there's
that
still some, and you intend to do these interviews with those people missing.
Yes.
And what are you doing when you got them all? Then you're
Well, there are
finished?
no, there are well, the podcast was not intended to be a regular thing. It happened because everyone was at home. It was easy to get the interviews, So that's why we had so many all of a sudden. So that was a good aspect of being confined at home. But some people didn't reply, some people couldn't at the time. But once I got the main ones, they're always researchers, and we have interviewed researchers, so people who are doing their PhDs, who are presenting new research. All of that is interesting. People who wrote, for example, interesting papers on a topic, and they can come and discuss that.
Okay. What's your position in the university? You are on the homepage of the university. Are you employed, or do you get a salary from the university?
Not currently, no.
Do you intend to go into this career path to become an employee of the academic?
Yes, if the opportunity comes, yes.
Okay, but Lisbon is a small university, I suppose, in this department, and your field is not that big for, how do you say this in English, for jobs in that field.
Well, yeah, and again, financing things, it's not easy.
Yeah. And I remember when I was doing my own doctoral project, which I failed, I'm non-read doctor person. I did astrology in law and 6 years in Hanover. And I realized when I was dealing with the people of the philosophy of science department, they had to write the applications for grants all the time. They were self-financing more or less their job. Is that what you would have to do yourself as well, to applicate by some organizations that in your university, the money goes to the university to pay your salaries? That's the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. In the case of Portugal, we have an organization that oversees all that kind of grant. And of course, the places are limited.
Yeah, that's like the German research association, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. That's the same.
It's a
okay. In one email you mentioned you have been in Frankfurt recently, astrologically or academically?
Academically.
What was it? What did you attend in Goethe University?
There was a small workshop organized by a colleague at the Goethe University in Frankfurt on religion and astrology.
So was it religious science professor who organized
it? She's an historian of religion.
Oh, historian of religion. So religious science, basically the department. Okay.
Yeah.
And who was there?
Well, several. That was an internal thing. Well, no, it was not truly internal. But it was for the academics to hear about this kind of discussions.
Why did you go?
Well, I was talking about the prohibitions of astrology. So,
you were a lecturer.
Yeah, I was a
lecturer. You were invited.
Yeah.
And how did they get to know you, to invite you?
Through papers and to exchange.
Okay.
I've wrote a lot because of the Jesuits. I've been writing a lot on religion and astrology in the early modern period, which is, let's say, the hot spot, for those collision, and so I was invited because of that.
That reminds me of Coco von Stuckrad when he was invited to Freiburg to the Bender Institute to present his neo-shamanistic studies. So basically, you're on the same track to present yourself with papers and academic research, and people invite you. And in the end, he ended up in Amsterdam and later in the University of Groningen with religious science. This is probably, that's your hope, I suppose. That would be the greatest achievement.
Yeah, well, yeah. Okay. The idea is always to research, to produce proper research, and of course, if you have the fund for it, it's wonderful.
Yeah. And now looking back on your second foot, which is the school, the headmaster role, How much time is for the school? How much time is for the research, for the academic part?
Well, it depends on responsibilities. If I have responsibilities or research contract with the university, then the university
Comes first.
comes first.
Yeah.
If I don't, then the school will be the point. Well, I'll try to keep the two running in any case.
Yeah, okay. Now, this balancing academic rigor and astrological school, did it change your character in relation to astrology that you did this academic path, that you are now a PhD and an awarded PhD graduate? Did that change you, this academic experience, in relation to what you do, what your school headmaster function is?
Not really. The school always started with a sort of academic modeling of the teaching of astrology, you know.
Okay.
So we always um, inspired people to look at the sources, to know how to not only just the technique, but look at the sources, be critical about astrology, because it's something that lacks tremendously today. You know, be critical, you know, does this work? Does this technique make sense? In a sense, is it aligned? Does it produce results? And then I think that's very important. So it didn't really change me. Um, at one point, Elena and I decided to go into academics, and that conference in 2004 was a sort of a shifting point in that process, because we wanted to write things that had substance. Because writing about astrology, you can produce a lot of good work, and I think I have at least make my effort to produce good work on astrology, but you're writing to a public which accepts everything.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the astrological public and community are very what's the word, permissive towards any form of astrology, or there's no criticism.
Anything goes.
Anything goes, exactly. It's an anything goes attitude. And
Now, let me pause here. Philosophy of science. Are you familiar with Paul Fayard?
a little bit.
So you know that his metaphor is anything goes.
Mhm.
And it
Yeah.
would be easier for you to get grants if he would be the dominating figure in the grant administration. Okay, that was just I interrupted you. Okay, continue.
Yeah, but so we decided to do something to produce more solid work, you know, and we were interested, you know, in astrology, not only by its practice, but also his history. You know, where these ideas come from? How do they develop in time? Because that has always been our posture towards astrology, and the academia allowed that. So from a very early point, we started to model our courses as something we were teaching. I remember that a little bit before Elena went into her course, we were teaching a course that we haven't done many times, which was at the time astrological culture. So a small course, and where you're introduced to history, lines of thinking, you know, philosophies within astrology, so you can navigate it. And we don't have that out there in the wild. You know, people accept everything without criticism, without peer reviewing. We don't really. I've said this, and I discussed this several times with some colleagues, who are being one of them, that one of the problems that we do not have peer reviewing.
And critical thinking is missing.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah. Okay.
There's even this thing: you cannot criticize other people's work.
Now,
yes, you can. You
I
don't
realize
have to
that
be mean.
you are very fond of peer reviewing, and I realized it in all the videos I was watching about with other people you have. I'm a little bit skeptic about the reality in university. I think there's a lot of peer reviewing corruption going on. How is your view on the problem of corruption in the peer review process?
Well,
You are in university, so you know what I mean.
I know what you mean. I know exactly what you mean. There's always problems. There is always problems. You can always have people cheating the system, and you do. And then sometimes you have a very light peer reviewing that occurs, but it is needed.
Okay.
And I myself, I've been everything that I published academic has been peer reviewed, and with the peer review process, especially a good, proper one, which most of the times it is.
So you were lucky. You didn't have any problems with this dark side of the peer review problem.
No, I think that is more towards the sciences and the technology bits. That's where the dark side is.
Where the
lies more.
money is rolling.
Yeah,
The patents
in
are
humanities,
where the patents are waiting.
yeah, in humanities, particularly history.
Why?
You're not going to get. You
Why
probably.
okay.
Yeah, you will have problems with egos and people opinions and people trying to move the topic into their perspective instead of accepting yours. And sometimes you have that struggle occasionally. But I usually I don't have a problem with peer review.
Okay.
And it's good. Sometimes you get a peer reviewer that doesn't agree with you and can be a bit nasty, but you still can learn from it.
Okay.
Because sometimes you can understand things like you're not giving enough substance to your argument for it to hold. And those people will say, you have to prove this. You need to explain this. And this is good. And this is a good thing. And I think we should have it in all fields, and especially astrology. Within astrology, and I'm talking about not something outside astrology, but astrology being self-critical of itself, it would be good as well. I think it's a good.
Going back to your academic part of your life, you are familiar with the work of Shlomo Sela and his editing of Abraham ibn Ezra.
Yes.
Did you read them?
Not all of them, but I've researched through them a lot.
Were they an important input for your academic part of your life? Did you learn things you hadn't expected to learn?
Yeah.
So elaborate.
Well, what Shlomo Sela produced and gives us is a good critical edition, a good edition of a very influential figure, which is Abraham ibn Ezra. He's very influential, especially towards my late medieval and Renaissance, early modern period, because he is quoted a lot. So it's good to understand how he's picking up the tradition before him and passing it on to the next. That is quite interesting to understand how certain developments of astrology take place. And
that goes right into your Ad Astra project to find out how techniques in traditional astrology since the Hellenistic times changed during history, and who were the people who were responsible for the changes. Do you have the impression that Ibn Ezra is one of the changers, or is he just reporting?
I think he's basically reporting.
Okay.
Because he states his opinion very clearly when he has one to give. So
would you be able? I have the same feeling that he's a reporter and not changing strongly. Would you agree with me that it would be possible to take the literature of Ibn Ezra and take it as a basis for an astrology education in traditional astrology? Not going back to the Hellenistic texts, but taking Ibn Ezra and only Ibn Ezra, and that's good enough.
It would make a large sum of it, yes.
It would work, you mean?
It would work. I think you always need input from other sources.
Yeah, okay.
But you could base a course on just Ibn Ezra. Yes, you could.
Okay. Shlomo Sela was involved with other people. I think David Just was part of it in the horoscope of Henry Batté of Mengelen. Do you know that book?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
What's your impression of the figure Henry Batté? What do you know about him? Can you tell our listeners what you know about Henri Batté?
Well, I'm not that familiar with the historical details. I've went through that book a long time ago. But he's one of those figures of the Renaissance that are interested in astrology, are translating astrology, are producing their own materials, their own notes, their own horoscopes, and was quite common. And his is one of the surviving records we have. But we have a lot of people doing that. We have a lot of very interesting figures, most of them unknown, that were studying astrology, were translating to Latin from sources or asking people to translate. And that shows the importance of certain texts and certain astrological materials. And I think he's a good example of that. Later on,
Looking
for
at
example, in Portugal, we find people translating texts from Latin to Portuguese, as the Latin knowledge comes out of fashion and people don't have the education to know enough Latin to read a source in Latin, they would ask people who were Latinists or who had the education in Latin to translate to the Portuguese language text in Latin, and you see that in Spain, and you see that in other regions as well. So there's this interest, certainly, in being able to read, as we have today, in reading sources written in languages which we do not dominate. We don't have it.
I know that Elena had to be fluent in Latin, right?
Yes.
How about yourself?
I wouldn't say I'm fluent. I'm not a Latinist, but I know enough to.
So you could read the edition of Henri Batté of his horoscope. For the
Yeah.
viewers, Henri Batté is famous because he was a practicing astrologer and a clerical man in the Catholic Church, and he produced in the 1280s, I think 1286 or something, he wrote down his own by astrological horoscope delineation. I'm not sure whether it was for an application for a new post or something, but anyways, he wrote it down in a manuscript, how he delineated, how in this manuscript we could learn, if we could read Latin, which I can't. You could read with your Latin knowledge, you could read the delineation text and the methods he was using in the delineation. And were you convinced when you read it that he was doing good traditional astrology?
Yeah, he's doing the standard.
So basically, it's a document which should be available in English.
Yes.
And they still haven't managed to translate it from Latin into English.
It's a lot of work.
The surrounding text is in English, but the core is still in Latin.
It's a lot of work, and there are more examples. All delineations are good documents to have. I've always said this. As an historian, they're extremely interesting because they are a direct application of the method and is a testimony of how the methods are applied. For an astrologer, now shifting to the astrological thing, if you're studying the astrological tradition, those kinds of documents is where you learn the most, because people get stuck discussing theory. 99% of the material we have are theoretical books. Even the examples they give are very theoretical. They're very fashioned for that thing. They're not complete. So we learn the theoretical basis, but what they do in theory and what they do in practice is very different.
Yes.
And you got, but how do they apply this? Perhaps they don't apply it like
That's why I'm doing this project of today. Let people see how they do it. Instead of just reading the books of Chris Brennan with Hellenistic Astrology, Dimitra George, Heavenly Spheres. Where is the information how they do it? And if the historians in 4000 want to know what you did, you haven't produced it because you're not going public with it, or you're not producing a book about it.
Yeah, well.
Okay. The focus of Elena's and your work is to look as a science person, as a historian of history of astrology, how the techniques developed. You are not interested in how the manuals of astrology developed. You are interested in how the techniques developed, which is a very niche focus. If you look back to your academic career, is there a special, really great highlight you remember in doing this academic work? I remember Eleanor and the story when the second manuscript was found in London when David Just was there on the Christmas party of the Warburg, and suddenly Eleanor had a second manuscript. Did you have something like that? This big highlight? Oh, this is great. I'm at the right place at the right time.
Well, sorry. You have always those little moments. I studied a manuscript which was in the British Library, which is a set of miscellanea of several documents pertaining to Jesuit teaching of mathematics, astronomy, astrology, which ended up for some reason at the British Library. And it's the only manuscript of that period. And that had the always attribute to a certain author. And when I was studying it, there was something a bit off. And there is 3 copies of the same text. And you start to realize that there's one of the copies which is annotated and where entire paragraphs and sentences are scratched out and then put into a different way. And then in the other 2 copies, it's not, it's already corrected. So that means usually that probably you're looking at the original where the author, did these annotations before having the final text. And that is a big moment. And suddenly there was a folio, quite discreet, in the middle of several others, and this is a huge volume, where at the corner he had the basis of the course. So he wrote something like, I will start by teaching the signs and then the planets and then the houses and then talk about the power of the fixed stars. And so he had, like you would do in a napkin, at the corner of a piece of paper, he had delineated the basis for the course that you are seeing complete early on in that volume. And that is a very interesting moment. And
so basically, I'm not going to compare that, but you had an experience like that. And the same library, the British Library, Wilhelm Gundel found the Liber Hermetis in a hidden text as well. Okay, yeah. This was the highlight. What was
one of them?
And you had a small highlight like that. Was there a very big frustration in your academic work? You remember where you were really frustrated? Jesus Christ, I give it up. This is just too often.
No, not that to that point of quitting, but sometimes you cannot access certain manuscripts.
Okay, well, that's normal. Okay.
Yeah, for several reasons.
Let's say every day's frustration. I'm looking at something special. Anything special? No. Well, you were lucky. You were lucky. The big frustration didn't reach to you.
No, not big enough to make me quit, but it's always frustrating not to know things for certain. Okay. You always get, there are arguments where you do your hypothesis and you're always hanging, you don't have the final proof of it, but you have to learn with it.
Okay, foundation of your work in the astrological field. In the Hellenistic times, the practicing astrologers were sort of philosophically orientated, either Hermetic or Stoic or Platonists. Let's say that's probably right. And some mixtures of all the 3. What about yourself? What's your philosophy?
I wouldn't know how to classify it. Really, I'm very.
You are not an hermetist. Not a hermeticist guy, I believe.
No, not really. I'm very pragmatic in my approach to things. So
okay. When it works, and that's good enough for you.
Yeah.
You don't.
I don't need to know why it works.
You don't need the God level of the 8th and 9th level of the Hermes philosophy. You don't need that for your foundation of what you're doing. Or do you have a? I suppose you're probably Catholic, Portuguese, probably.
Well, I'm not Catholic. I do live in a Catholic background.
You haven't been Catholic at all, ever? How did that come about? Because you are a Catholic country.
Yeah, well, I'm not in a religious family. My family is not that.
Oh, your family didn't force you
not
to go to church. Okay.
Yeah, so from my generation, no one is baptized.
Any alternative you apply? I was 22 years in a Rosicrucian context.
Well, I studied esotericism, several stuff on esotericism, of course, but there's nothing I can't say I'm in this line or in that line. With astrology, I became very pragmatical, you know.
Okay. So you didn't study the philosophers like the Neoplatonists like Plotinus, Porphyrius, and Proclus, or you didn't interest yourself about what philosophy was behind Kepler or something like that?
Well, it's always interesting, and I do like to know, and I do like to read their points of view, but that is not the.
That's more informative. That's not founding you.
Yeah. Well, the founding element there is, if we can put it like this, is the way that you verify how all this geometry of the planets, in the case with astrology and all this geometry, that's the best word I have to say, works, and how it moves things around, and how it exists and how it is. I think that's more my kind of line of.
Coming back to your headmaster role and teaching astrology, your courses are 15 people, something like that?
15, sometimes 30, depends on the years.
And you have them both live and online, right?
I had them both live and online. At this point, I'm just doing them online. Because
you are now shifting to online.
Yes, because what happened with the online was that the in-presence, if you're doing simultaneous online and in presence, the quality of the transmission is not as good as this one that we have here right now for those who are online. And when we went with COVID to full online, what happened is suddenly people who are outside of Lisbon, outside of Portugal, and who want to enroll in the course, they can.
And how is your clientele now? How much percentage is Portuguese online, and how much is outside Portugal?
Well, the majority is Portuguese, I would say.
Still okay.
Still,
and you're teaching in English.
I'm teaching in Portuguese and in English.
Oh, you have an online course in Portuguese?
Yeah, so the site that you showed is the English site. Yeah. There is an equivalent in Portuguese as well.
Yes. And you have these modules. You have the traditional course. Now let's get into the details of what people are learning. From start to finish, on your site, there are a lot of modules. There are present ones and old ones. Are the old ones active? Do you use them, or is it just a reminiscence?
It is a reminiscence, and they will disappear eventually. Okay. But I keep them available to people to review the course as long as I can.
The people who had them can still get into them, but I, as a new one, couldn't go into the old modules.
Well, you could if you wanted to, but you will not have the. But I have active modules where you can have the direct.
The interaction teaching. Is only with the active module. Now,
I don't like video only based teaching.
Okay.
You know, there are some people who by time zones or by their work they cannot be at the classes, so they will do it. They will watch it later, and it's okay. And people have been used to doing that for quite some times. But I like to talk to an audience, have questions.
So basically, your online course is an online presence course. It's a live course.
It's a live course. Yeah.
You have to be there in the chat room live if you want to participate in that course.
Yeah, exactly.
So the traditional course of astrology is how long or how much time consuming is it for the student?
Well, it's still being, the English version is still being thought out because I've been adapting. My course in Portuguese, which is the main one,
Yes.
is for 2 years, weekly, one class weekly.
Oh, I have to be present online for 2 years. That's demanding. Okay.
Yeah, it had been and it was larger at some point, because that will include the basics, all the basic principles, all the basis of delineation,
And it's
all the
interactive. It's all the time interactive, like
yeah
in a virtual
yeah
university.
yeah exactly. Then it have the advanced delineation, the predictive techniques, and then working example. The last months are working example charts,
So that's 2
applying all the.
years.
That's the 2 years. Yeah.
And how much money would a student have given to you if he put the whole 2 years?
I would think around 1,000 something euros for the whole thing.
That's moderate. That's not expensive.
No, I'm not.
You should promote your English version because you would be a very bad competitor for the high price people.
Yeah, I'm thinking of readapting my courses to this structure. I've been very modular with English because people do not want to be 2 years, learning something. But
Yeah,
if you
that's
really
a
want,
problem. That's a
yeah,
problem.
but if you really want to study a subject and master it,
You have to go to university life, so you have to be there present as well.
you have to invest on it. You have to invest some time on it. And I think, 2 hours per week is quite good.
It should be okay. Yeah, okay.
It's not that demanding, I think.
If you compare your 2 years with the certificate and the diploma course of Robert Zoller, is that approximately the same amount of content?
Probably.
Okay. So you are a follow-up on Robert Zoller's course, except that you have a life situation. Because
Yeah, well, I don't.
Zoller was obviously not a life situation, a virtual
No, it
life
wasn't.
situation.
I don't follow his module, of course, the
No,
way
that's for
he
sure.
taught. But well, the topics are the same. Any course on astrology.
So basically, you would say your diploma, your aim is to have the same diploma level as the diploma level of Robert Zoller's course.
Yeah, and I think I must say better because I try to be present.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I understand.
Which is something he couldn't, for several reasons, for technical reasons, practical reasons, and because of his health, he couldn't be.
In one of your videos, there was the subject glossary book. Is that still in the making?
Yeah.
When will we have it?
I don't know.
Remember Bruno Huber started the same thing in German, and he didn't finish it.
It's complex.
Yeah,
it's complex.
and
it's never going to be finished.
There's
always something. That's a problem with glossaries. It's never finished.
Will it be a print version or an online version?
I'm still deciding that. I would like to have a print version.
Okay, very good.
I would like to have.
So don't forget to tell me when it's available in English, please. Because we don't have that.
It is being written in English directly. It's not being.
Oh, okay. Now, the subject of your academic work, the development of the traditional astrological techniques over time. When you were talking with Michael Bryan of the Oraculus podcast, you were talking about combustion as one example, how it changed and how people misunderstand it. If you had to choose the 3 most misunderstood techniques today because of this development in history, what would these 3 most misunderstood techniques be?
It's an interesting question.
Where you are mostly frustrated that people don't get it?
Oh, I think the delineation process itself.
Okay, that's one. I understand that.
Process. People tend to go to planets in signs still, and I'm talking about traditionalists. I'm not even talking about the modern line,
Yeah,
because when
planets
I'm
in
talking,
sign, yeah.
yeah, I'm in contact with people learning from the
So
tradition.
basically, you would also say people are wrong not to using the terms, right?
Yeah. And one of the most annoying things for me at this point, I think, it's sun sign. The sun
Okay.
sign. That idea that the sun is an essential point to interpret in a natal chart.
Whereas the ascendant is the main.
The ascendant is the
Okay.
main point. And I
Okay.
hear my colleagues constantly following that same error and giving so much importance to sun signs.
Yes, okay.
Sun signs do not really matter
So
that
that's
much.
the second or third one?
The
Technically,
third one,
you are frustrated at limite.
well, essential conditions of the planets, I think.
Okay.
No,
Essential
not essential,
as
sorry. Well,
dignities.
essential and accidental, the conditions
Yeah,
of the planets in
yeah,
general.
yeah.
I think
Dignities.
people,
You're talking about dignities.
dignities in general, yes.
Yeah.
From the dignities themselves to exaltation, triplicity, etc., to the oriental, occidental, superior, etc. I think people make,
And sect is missing nowadays completely.
yeah, it's people forget that these things are, how can I put it? I was discussing this earlier yesterday with my students. These are things that you add to the base interpretation. They do not become the interpretation itself. And people tend, when you're learning, you need to know the definition of these things, identify it, know how to interpret. That's okay. That's the process of learning.
So in your approach, dignities is not central.
They are central, but they are not the starting point. They are just telling you more information on things.
Okay,
Um,
I get
you
you.
see,
Okay.
if you don't have the initial sentence, astrological sentence, properly done, that is going to add more confusion to it.
So if you do the ascendant with all its facets correctly, then the dignities supplemented.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is the problem of signification.
Okay.
If you don't
Now,
give a signification to the planets, you're going to have a hard time trying to understand, oh, but this, I'd like to say, this Venus is oriental and, I don't know, in Hais. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. It only means when you give that Venus a signification.
yes.
If you don't give the planet a signification, you're working on nothing. It's
I
just
mean,
theoretical concepts and
that
possibilities.
was in your text in the first edition of the traditional journal, which gives me an opportunity for another question. We have this problem of assigning points in tradition, right? You are calculating this aspect as 6 points, this is 5 points, this is 3 points, and then we add them all up to come up with the sum. I have a problem with that, me personally, not being representative. What do you think is the advantage of giving those points instead of trying to get the meaning of these as different factors without using mathematical addition?
Well,
Summing up.
let me make a comparison. When you're doing your cooking and you're making a dish for the first time, you need to follow the recipe with
I
those
agree.
exact amounts.
Yes.
So, and once you've done it, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 times, you get your hang of it, you put a little bit more of that.
Okay.
And so that counting, especially the essential dignities, the essential, I think it's important, serve as a reminder that there's a hierarchy of power between those concepts. And those things have a certain degree, and as there's a degree of power there, and the best way of measuring it is mathematical. That doesn't need, you need to follow it rigidly, but not to follow it rigidly needs experience.
Okay.
And my problem with people nowadays, they very quickly have opinions on that without really testing that out and having, I don't know, 10 years of practice, of true practice of dignities to sustain that kind of hands-free measuring of things, which you can do, but you don't do that with 1 or 2 years of astrology. You do that with 10 years of astrology, and people forget time and experience and have these very lofty opinions about how dignity should be counted or not counted. But everything that is mathematical is trying to give you a quantity. So it's trying to quantify something that is important with essential dignities. There is a quantity there as well. It's not just that, it goes beyond that, clearly. It is a quality as well, but it would still be useful to apply that quantity. When it comes to a later period, when they are also attempting to quantify the accidental dignities, then it gets a bit more complicated.
Okay.
Because the fact is that historically there is not one complete system for the accidental dignities. There are several attempts at doing that. And it can be a bit more dangerous. But still, my students who decide to do the whole table and do the numbers, what good thing that comes out of it is that they already know the conditions of the planets. They get the mastery of the chart. And that is also another problem today. You get everything too ready on the computer. And once you get too ready on the computer, you have no mastery of the chart whatever. You see? Because you're not working the chart properly from the beginning.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that people would have to calculate it by hand. I don't do it myself. But if we did, by the time we would have the chart drawn, you would already have a lot of information that would be valuable for the interpretation.
Yes.
Which you lose. And especially when you start having programs that do all the computations, they sell you the dignities, they are calculating eye legs now, they are calculating that. That's not something a computer can do. And I've seen professionals following that mistake as well. Of thinking that, Solify says my heel leg is this one. Yeah, but that's not how you do it.
Do you use a computer program?
Yeah, I use Solar Fire and Janus.
Okay. When your students are in the course, 2 years of collaboration, you meet in the virtual life situation, you get to know your students. What are the present day problems, the highest problems for students of today in your course? What's your impression? What makes them the most difficulties?
Well, I think it's still this. Let me see. A number of years ago, the main problem was that people were confused with astrology. This before the tradition became a thing. People were hearing a lot of opinions from various peoples, most of them with no source at all. People would hear a lot of opinions and have all these wonderful, fabulous ideas about spirituality, psychology, healing, whatever, and had no idea how to pick up a chart and read it.
Yes.
And it would be a mess. There would be an unstructured thing. Then the tradition came. And one of the good things of the tradition is that it has a backbone, which is the same throughout the ages, and you can rely on it as your basis. And that served for a time to structure an approach to astrology. You would have that good route on which you could find your support for your delineation. And now I'm keep finding the same confusion I would find 20 years ago in astrology students is now popping up in traditional students. And I'm talking about people who have come into astrology through the tradition directly. Because you have Hellenistic and you have medieval, and people manage to pick up what is a whole system and fragment it in little bits and pieces, then they cannot make them work because they're always contradicting
So
themselves.
they should only
This.
read Ibn Ezra probably, and then no confusion comes along.
Yeah, that is a problem. It is a problem of a lack of a system. You need a system where you can contain your knowledge and your learning.
Okay.
Once you have that system in place and you trust it because you have practiced and you have your own feedback of how the system operates, then you can look at the context and start, perhaps picking a variation and said, oh, I think this author might be correct about that topic, so I'll adjust.
How do you approach that problem with your students? Do you tell them, don't read that, just stay in the course and don't read anything else?
Yeah.
Okay. Strict?
Yeah.
You're strict on that? Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm not strict. People are free to do whatever they want.
But you
This is an advice.
you wouldn't allow the situation in your virtual life situation that somebody comes in with an information which doesn't belong to your system, so that's off topic. No, we don't discuss it here.
No, I will discuss it.
Oh, you will? Okay.
And I will explain why. Is it that different, and what's the difference? I'm not.
Okay.
I don't run a.
Okay, let's
boarding school for
let's simulate a situation. I would be a student in your course, okay, and you were teaching house system. You use Alkebusius houses, and I said, why don't you use whole sign houses? Isn't that better? That would be my student question. What would you say?
Oh, I say what I usually say. I do not give the whole house system enough sensitivity or let's say accuracy that another quadrant system has.
In what areas are the accuracy deficitaire?
You don't have house cusps. That's the starting point.
That's the starting point. That's true.
And house cusps do give more substance and more shading to the whole process.
Okay.
But
if you take the ascendant, okay, which is 70% of the chart, that could be done with the whole sign system, then, in your opinion?
Well, depends.
Okay, elaborate.
Let's say that you have an ascendant at 27 degrees of a sign. Let's say Gemini.
Okay.
And there's a planet in Cancer close enough to that ascendant so that it is an angular planet of the first house in a quadrant system, but it would not be. It would be a second house planet in a whole sign house.
That's true. Yeah. Okay. And these are special cases. What about the not so special cases?
Well, when we're talking generic, there are charts where there's no real difference.
Right. Okay.
But
so basically, your argument is, in a quadrant system like Alkebusius, we need the Alkebusius for these situations. And if we don't have these situations for the ascendant problem, the whole sign system would suffice.
Well, what happens throughout history is that all the testimonies that exist on practicing astrology, they always say things which are less accurate mathematically can work for generic things. Yes. But if you want specificity and precision, you need the mathematics. Involved. That's the attitude that I see in all astrologers of the past.
Do your students, as you mentioned with Chris Brennan's video, you teach calculating the chart, right, by hand and with a computer for the mathematical process? Do your students have problems with that?
People are very resistant, very afraid of mathematics.
Yeah.
I think that's unfortunately a cultural thing. But I do want them to at least once in their life calculate the chart with the tables.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not that difficult. I think people, make a whole lot of a big problem out of nothing.
In Germany, for the diploma of the German Association, the Deutsche Astrologenverband, you have to write a thesis, a long thesis. What about your course? Do you write a long thesis?
You need to present a research on a chart, let's say, sort of a thesis, not a thesis. I wouldn't call it a thesis, but a large report at the end. Yes.
Is it a delineation text where they have to delineate a chart?
Yeah.
How many pages? 30 pages at least?
No, not that big.
Not that big. Okay. It's a small text. Okay.
Yeah. By the time, because I'm dealing with the students directly, most of the time I know
what they are able of. Okay.
What they are capable of doing,
okay.
etc.
One interesting problem in traditional astrology is some people say you can't find the soul in the chart. Stephen Birchfield in Norway, in his course, talks about the quality of the soul in the chart. What's your opinion? Can you find the qualities of the soul in the chart, especially in the ascendant area?
Yeah, but the soul there is not the soul in the same sense as the modern esoterics have it.
Okay.
Soul there, that comes from Ptolemy, and soul there is, the word he's using is psyche. So actually, those are the significators of psyche, so of the mind, of the psychology of the individual. They're not exactly the soul in the same sense as, I don't know, an hermetic or a theosophist would say soul, which is that which survives beyond the body. We're talking about the mind.
Okay, so basically you're saying the subject of psychotherapists can be found in the chart, not the sole subject of the Hermetic scriptures.
Well, that's a philosophical debate. Is the soul in the chart or not? Well, it's a good question. I don't have an answer for it.
Okay. Any opinion
Does
on
the soul exist outside ourselves, or is the soul what we call the soul just a sub-product of what we are?
Yeah. And it's the neurocognition sciences. What is consciousness? What is matter? We are getting into deep waters here.
But what you find generally in any text that approach, and I'm not at all an expert on this, I haven't read everything, but what I have read so far is that when they go into that aspect, astrology is always a very material thing. So astrology is speaking, even in non-Christian contexts, about the materiality of the body. So it's your material condition.
Which would mean the first book of Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim, the first book is on this level, and the second is on the celestial level, and the third book is on the divine level in his 3 books of Occulta Philosophia. So basically you are saying astrology belongs only to the first book of the Occulta Philosophia of von Nettesheim and has nothing to do with the celestial and the divine spheres.
Well, it is a celestial thing, so I wouldn't put it in those. I wouldn't put it in those particular boxes. You see,
no, the box is different. Okay, my fault. The box is different. When Agrippa talks about celestial sphere, that's above the moon.
Yeah, let me put it another way. Astrology is the interpretation of a specific moment in time and in a place, using the heavens, the configuration of the heavens. Most of the people think about a human birth, but it can be an event, can be something else.
Yeah.
No? But let's say a human, but those events don't have soul in that same sense. So a human. So astrology pertains to that physical manifestation.
Okay.
In that context.
Yeah, okay.
Does it have any spiritual contact? Well, it has, since one has a spirituality, and spirituality is part of one's existence. So there will be some spiritual contact into astrological interpretation. But if you go more absolute into the nature of what a human being is, and if you think there is a spirit, something that is undying, supernatural, eternal, that is manifesting through that event, is it on the chart? Probably not.
It's open for discussion. Okay.
Yeah. Probably not. But again, this depends on how you're approaching it philosophically.
Okay. You are friends with Dorian Giesler Greenbaum, right?
Yes, I am.
You know her book, The Diamond.
Yeah.
Now that begs the question, what do you think of diamonds? Do they exist or do they not exist? As an entity, a spiritual entity, not materialized, obviously, but on the angel or higher levels, it could exist as an entity. What's your opinion on diamonds in today's time?
Do thoughts have a life of their own? Do obsessions have a life of their own? Do tastes have a life of their own? Perhaps they do. They do exempt lives of their own. So perhaps, I don't know exactly in what form they exist, but there is some kind of, let's say, we are physical, but we are also thought, because we think, we produce thoughts.
So you
At least some people do.
You wouldn't go as far as I would go, that I have a guardian angel as an entity.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't go that far.
Well, not so sure about that.
Taking angels as real is not your cup of tea.
Not in the literal sense people
No,
usually
that's
intend.
what I mean. Okay. When I was talking with Elena, we were talking about the archetypal philosophy of Carl Gustav Jung. And I am working on this problem, what is an archetype in the sense of Jung's psychology?
Mm.
And there are people who think that the archetypes are living entities, and there are people who say, no, they are not. What's your position there?
I don't think I have one.
Okay.
It's not something I considered.
No, it's no problem. If you go into your academic field, looking at the old documents, which all the problems about documents, I believe Vettius Valens, the first manuscript is from the 15th century, I believe, and there's nothing real before that. So we deduce from a paper of the 15th century something about somebody living in the 2nd century, and the same seems to apply to Ptolemy as well. Now, if you take these traditions of documents and realizing that the real concrete document is very young and doesn't reflect what's really going on 800 years before that. Is there an author which you rely more than on other authors? For example, do you follow the opinion that Ptolemy is an idiot and Vettius Valens is the good guy? Do you have opinions like that?
Not that extreme. And I wouldn't go for Vettius Valens. I would go for Dorotheus.
Okay,
as
you would prefer Dorotheus, okay.
Yeah.
So we have one, Dorotheus, okay.
Dorotheus, because let's say the problem with that dichotomy is not Ptolemy Vettius Valens. That's a thing that started to happen 3-5 years ago. That discussion came up, because I'm not sure, and I'm not an expert on this. Levente Lazo probably would answer this very well because it's his field of study. But Vettius Valens, although it is mentioned throughout the tradition, is not really one of the major sources. He's referred to, but as far as I know, most authors appear to refer it as a second-hand reference. The part of marriage according to Vettius Valens. That's the one I remember at top. So they've seen it, they've heard speak a bit, but I think very few people must have worked with Vettius Valens documents. Perhaps the Byzantine astrologers would have, because it's a Greek tradition.
Abu Mashar seems to have relied on Vettius Valens a bit.
No,
do I remember that right?
I don't know. No, I don't know.
But okay, take Dorotheus, another one.
But so Vettius Valens and Ptolemy are not the informants of the tradition.
We leave them fight somewhere else. What you take Dorotheus as a reliable foundation. Another person in history, astrologer, Firmicus Maternus.
No,
not your cup of tea.
No, Firmicus Maternus is a mess. So
probably Arabic text, Abu Mashar.
Abu Mashar is nice. He's not the most organized of persons, but yes, he does a good job. Abu Mashar is good. Ali Ben Rajal was a very important text for me. when I was constructing and learning.
Abi Ben Rachel, is he translated into English?
No.
For our viewers who can read German, the Abi Ben Rachel text is in a book in Germany.
Ooh.
And it's this thick. It's called Lehrbuch der klassischen Astrologie by Rafael Gil Brandt, which is a Spanish guy. He participated in that research group in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And he produced a German book this thick and a second German this thick, Matrix, using Ben Rachel's text.
Okay. Yeah, because the person who did the research on that tradition was Gerald Hilty. I don't know if he's still alive. If he is, he's very old.
Mm.
He did the first edition from the Castilian version.
Why did nobody put this into English? It's a lot of work invested, and nobody uses it to translate it. Strange.
Because
okay.
people have choices.
Yeah.
We don't have that many people translating. We have Ben Dykes, basically.
Yeah.
Very few people.
What's your opinion on Benjamin Dykes? Is he a good translator?
I wouldn't know because I don't read
okay.
Arabic, so I wouldn't be
Okay.
able to judge that. I do have an opinion on the way. I think
he reminds me sometimes about he's a pupil of Robert Zoller, and when he talks about the academic translators, he reminds me of Robert Zoller when he brushes them off. What do you think about that?
Well, what I think about the translations is that I think there's let me put this so I'm not misunderstood. I think we do have terminology for astrological techniques and methods, which is Western, which is English, because we're talking about translations to English, which is English. And I think they are creating, there's a whole school of Ben Dykes, I think has been participating in that, of creating new terminology, which I think is completely unnecessary.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't facilitate the reading of the texts. If you have to stop at every other word or every 3 or 5 words to understand, wait, what is this? And I'm talking about people who understand the texts. I'm not talking about students who have never read an astrology text, especially an older one. Why are we making up new terminology when we know exactly how to translate? For example,
mm-hmm.
he uses to use the word stakes for the angles.
Mm-hmm.
Why, if we have the word angles? He can put a footnote. I would put a footnote. It's his translation, it's its work, it's his choices, of course. But I would prefer to see that with the normal terminology so that is readable, instead of we having to have almost a glossary of terms to read a book that is not assisting the translation. And for example, if you read an academic translation, for example, by Charles Burnett, you don't have that problem.
Yes. Okay.
Because the terminology is updated and it's fluent in the way you read it. And some of Ben's translations are not, because he's choosing to keep a very old dated tradition, which sometimes probably it's necessary because there's not an equivalent term, but a lot of that work can be solved with a footnote. And when you explain here the term is this one because of the context, the culture, the language, etc. And I think that is getting the books difficult to read.
Okay.
It's not a fluent reading.
Yeah.
That's my only thing to point out.
I think you're right there.
He probably has I'm sure he has a perfect explanation on his part why he chose to do it like that. That's a translator's prerogative to
well,
choose.
that's what Ibn Ezra had to do when he translated into Hebrew. He invented new terms. Well, that might be correct because Arabic and Hebrew is a different story than. Okay.
In Hebrew they had a problem, and I know that because I have been in projects that studied Hebrew texts, technical texts, and that's a problem because if the word exists in Hebrew already, it's one thing, but if you're suddenly translating new knowledge produced in Latin, let's say, or in vernacular, and you want to put it into Hebrew, they had a lot of problems because there were no words
Yes.
in Hebrew
Yes.
that would be equivalent or be
That's what even Ezra had to solve. Yeah.
exactly. So they would have to create words
Yeah.
or sometimes transliterate directly the Latin word.
Yeah. Whereas Ben Dykes would have had terminology available to him he didn't use. Okay.
Yeah, but
Okay. You have a aversion against the term Renaissance. Could you?
no, Renaissance is a very
You don't like the word Renaissance, right?
no, because for example, to say that Lilly is a Renaissance author historically is highly incorrect. You know, by the time of Lilly, by the 17th century, Renaissance was done and over.
Yes.
We were in a completely different mindset.
But I'm more interested in your opinion on. You don't like the term because it's so difficult to give a starting point, because we have Renaissance in Charles the Great in 800 aspect.
Well, the Renaissance, as it's put historically, the one we identify as the Renaissance, so the 15th century, late
1453 and onwards.
and onwards, that Italian movement, you know, the Greek, the beginning of Greek, that's a very specific point in time. No, it's that period there. And sometimes it's also specific geographically.
Yes.
Because that's not going to occur at the same time everywhere. So that cultural movement, which is very important and very, very key to understand that historical period, is dated on at that time. Once you go into the 16th and 17th century, it's no longer really Renaissance. It moved beyond that. That process has already been incorporated, and it's moving on from itself, you know, to other stuff. You can see that in art, for example. You know, you have the Renaissance art, and then it moves along very. Then you have the Baroque. You know, so by the time we're talking about all these authors, William Lilly, the Renaissance authors, the Cardano, we're talking about the Baroque. We're not talking about the Renaissance exactly as we would see it. Yeah. So it is a matter of terminology. So to give such a wide period Renaissance is not really accurate. But it is very debatable, even historically, when does a period end and starts, you know, where do you consider it? As you pointed out, there are several Renaissances to consider. You have the Carolingian Renaissance, which you're pointing to. You have later on also the Renaissance of the 12th century with the translations of the of works from Arabic to Latin and to Spanish. So there are several Renaissances, but the Renaissance is, I think, it's very allocated in time and in geography. And by the time we reach the 16th and 17th century, and most of the time in astrology context, we're talking about 16th and 17th century authors. That's no longer the Renaissance, truly.
When you studied medieval aspects, did you ever come about the 13th century with the guy called, his name was Hugo de Balma in Paris? Never.
No, I don't think.
Not something for you. Okay.
No.
The rationalization of astrology is a topic, right? Could you tell us your position?
Well, that is a product of, again, of its own time. I have a chapter in my thesis and in my future book dedicated on the mathematization of astrology, and other authors have talked about this, in which you can see that comes with the early modern period, so 15th century onwards, where you're trying to make things more scientifical. So
I think it started with the approach to be more Aristotelian than Platonic in the Arabic times, and that's more. And then later on, it got more mathematic. But that, I think, the starting point is when the astrologers decided we want to be Aristotelian and not Platonic. Would you agree?
Well, I'm not sure if there's a point where someone says that. I think that's. I think that most astrologers, the practicing ones, are not going to debate if they're Platonic or Aristotelian.
Oh, some confess I'm Platonic. You can find Charles Orbit is one of those. He's
but
yeah.
that's the person's own philosophical posture, religious posture, etc.
Okay.
Most of the astrologers thinking historically are concerned with practice.
Yes.
So they don't really are going to be thinking about that in deep. You find that in other works, which are reflecting upon astrology or what the nature of knowledge, etc. And then you have that kind of discussion. But I think the average astrologer wouldn't have that kind of discussion. Like today,
Okay, I think my last question would be, if you had the chance to organize a traditional astrology organization, and you would have to decide which is allowed to enter, what people of today would come to mind? Who would be part of your new association? Sharon Knight, for example?
I'm not going to even go there. I wouldn't. From the experience I have, I wouldn't organize anything.
Okay. Now, let's put it in other words. Do you have a network of people which are thinking like you?
Yes.
How many?
Well,
3 or 30?
Well, more close to 3 than 30.
Okay.
I think.
So basically, we have the situation that on your level, not that many people who can talk with you.
In a sense, for example, one of the things astrologically is that I don't use the new planets.
Well, that's understandable.
And nowadays, not only there are more people using the new planets, and I've already seen and heard some criticism of our non-peer-reviewed friends out there, accusing of fundamentalist people who don't use the modern planets. So that starts to be complicated. I don't usually bother people, what they do or do not, even if I think they're doing something absolutely stupid nonsense. But
what's the problem? I mean, I know what the problem is, but our viewers might not know what the problem is. I can refer the viewers to this very interesting podcast with Chris Brennan and Benjamin Dykes about Robert Soller. What is, for our viewers now, we both know what we're talking about, why we shouldn't use the outer planets. What would you, if you would be invited to a public speak situation for people who don't know much about astrology or who are only psychological astrology, what would you tell them? What are they doing to the craft when they use the outer planets?
Well, they're taking into consideration, they're assuming certain meanings and certain operative qualities that those planets are supposed to have, which are not really verified, are not acquired, and 90% of them or more are not acquired astrologically. They're acquired theoretically by thinking, if the world is pink, then my glasses are also, stuff like that. And most of the way that their meaning is justified in modern astrology does not mix philosophically and ontologically with the tradition, and people don't realize this.
And if you use Pluto, Saturn gets unemployed.
If you follow the reasoning, yes, but it doesn't. So what's happening there? The thing is, and so you cannot choose one thing and the other at the same time. I always give this example with the asteroids. People who use the asteroids, at least the ones that are more loud in their use, assume that the asteroid acquires meaning through the naming that it has. So, for example, and I've seen this example around somewhere, if the asteroid was named Beer, apparently there's one out there with that name, then it would mean beer or astrological things that are related to beer. If you assume that is correct, that philosophy of giving meanings to a celestial body is completely different from the philosophy of giving meaning to celestial bodies that the tradition has. So you cannot put the two things together. It's olive oil and water. They don't mix. You cannot make coexist in the same practice systems which are incompatible by nature. And people don't see this. And this extends to a lot of things. You know, I've seen traditionalists speaking about the signs and then saying, but we shouldn't use the zodiacal alphabet of sign equals house equals planet. But then they're attributing to that sign a lot of significations that are clearly coming from the house, which they erroneously supposedly correspond to, and not to the sign. So again, and it's very difficult. You know, I've passed through the process of stripping myself as much as I could of what I've learned of modern to be able to fully understand the tradition. It's not an easy process, but
Yes.
nowadays we're seeing a mixture, which I think is extremely toxic to the tradition. And I think people have not realized how toxic it is.
Yes. Okay. Before we come to the end, the copyright declaration, I have the right to publish this very, very nice talk with Luis Ribeiro, uncut and unedited on my channel and my homepages, whereas Luis has the right to do whatever he wants to do with the footing. He can put a 7-minute video with music and pictures to do some public relation with it. So that's the copyright declarations. Did I miss to ask something important?
I don't know, so many things we could talk about.
Should we talk about something I missed?
Well,
Something on your astrological hard side and something on your academic field hard side.
well, I can take one that I've spoken to students this a lot, and this is an opportunity of speaking it a bit more publicly, is that I've joined in myself two different perspectives, the one of the historian and the one of the astrologer, which, as I told you by email, I don't mix in the
Yes.
sense that when I'm being an historian of science, specifically an historian of astrology, I'm an historian. I'm not an astrologer. To keep things well separate. One thing is to study a practice. The other thing is to do it. There might be interceptions and knowledge cross information of knowledge, but I keep them separately. But nowadays, I think people are too much enamored with history of astrology in the astrological community. And although that's important, and I think people should know the history of astrology as much as they could, they forget that history is not practice. Knowing a lot of history of astrology is not the same as being a good practitioner of it. And sometimes I think people get a little bit mixed in that sense. You don't need to know history to practice astrology. You just need to know the system and attain the mastery required to do it properly. You should know history. Yes, you should. It's culture that you should know. But one thing is not the same as the other. And I think people sometimes are mixing up discussions of history with discussions of astrology. And that can be very complicated. And it can at some points, as I usually say, throw a wrench into the cogwheel. So you get stuck because you're discussing the history of a method instead of practicing it. And you shouldn't. You should practice it, see the results, test it extensively, and then you can discuss what is historically correct or more entitled with what you're observing the method to be, or how the method is operating, and not the opposite. So this is my caveat, I would say, to students nowadays.
So you take clients from all over the world if they pay the 80 euros.
Yeah.
What astrology do you not offer? Do you do a mundane astrology with clients?
No one has ever requested, and it's
But
not a
you
service.
would do it if they would come.
Yeah, I
along.
usually do mundane as a research for myself when I
And
have
you
the
could
time.
offer it to a president of the United States if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Like
I
Ronald Reagan
I
did
would
with.
do my best work. I always say that
Or we could
we
take
might have specialties. We
we
might
could
have
use Elizabeth Tessier as an example, be closer to home in President Mitterrand. Okay, you do
but I
mundane.
always think in that regard that as an astrologer, you should know all the tools
Yes,
that are available to you. You might be better at one or the other. You have more expertise, you have more experience in, for example, you can have more experience in natal astrology than you have on orrery or elections, or vice versa, but you should know them all, mundane included.
Okay, when a client from Australia would want to have an orrery consultation, how would you deal with the technical problems, the place of the chart, the time of the chart? How would you solve that?
No, the time of the chart in the place is when I read it, and
so, but when you read the email,
yeah,
and it's your place, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have no more questions. I'm very glad that we did this. It was very nice of you to take your time. Thanks from the viewers and from myself to you.
Thank you for having me here.
I stopped the recording.